Takk fyrir. Setjist þið aftur. Takk. Þetta alltaf mikið. Þá komum við að næsta fyrirlestri og þetta hann David Eaves sem lektor við Harvard Háskóla í opinberri stefnumótun og ætlar að fjalla tækifæri Íslands og svona alþjóðlega trenda eða tilhneigingar. David, can you hear me?
I can.
Excellent. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling great. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, excellent. We're really excited to hear what you have to say. So please take it away. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. As I said, I'm very, very excited to be here. I have many connections to Iceland and have visited your country a number of times. And so I'm just thrilled to be able to talk to you. I am actually also, part of what I'm doing in my responsibilities here at Harvard, I'm running a program on digital transformation for the chief digital officers for a number of for capital cities across Europe, of which the Icelandic team, the Reykjavik team, is part of. And so if they're in the room or online, they're actually seeing me for maybe the 6th or 7th or 8th time because they're part of a course I'm teaching. And they've been wonderful to work with, and I'm actually going to probably showcase them a little bit in the next couple of weeks when we bring all of these chief digital officers back together. Before I get started, maybe just a few words about me and who I am. I'm a lecturer of public policy at Harvard University, where I teach on digital transformation. My background is a little bit more varied. I actually started off as a negotiation expert, which has proven to be enormously helpful because one of the things that I think you probably are already aware of is that as difficult and as challenging as the technical issues are, the human challenges are always bigger and more difficult. And so having a background in thinking about conflict and managing disputes and managing differences has proved to be enormously helpful in the digital transformation space. Every year I teach 2 exec ed programs, and then I teach like several hundreds of degree students who are all doing Masters of Public Policy and Masters of Public Administration. And then in addition, I do things like this. I'm also very pleased to say that I train the Presidential Innovation Fellows every year at the White House and the Code for America Fellows at Code for America. So I've spent a lot of time with technologists who are trying to change the way governments work. And then the final piece I do is every year I convene digital transformation experts from countries around the world in June just to share best practices and talk about what's going on, of which Andrew from Iceland joined us this year for the first time. It was a real pleasure having him and some of his team. So let me talk about, here's what I want to say today. There's kind of 4 key points. I want to talk about where we are kind of as governments around the world. What's the current state? I think there's an emerging North Star where people are trying to move towards, of which Iceland is now kind of positioning itself to be at the forefront of. So there's a North Star about where people agree that governments need to get to when it comes to thinking about technology and service delivery. There are a number of emergent strategies about how to get to that destination. And then I think there are some unique advantages that Iceland has that I want to talk about. So I'm going to try to do all of this in a relatively quick period, ideally under 20 minutes, to leave a few minutes for questions because I'd love to hear concerns or ideas or questions that you all have. So let me start with where we are. So most governments in the world, if you kind of look at them, you can kind of break them down as being something that's relatively simple, right? So there's the agency or the department. There's applications that they're trying to run, and that could be getting a driver's license, getting a passport, signing up for a benefit, paying your taxes. Whether that happens in paper or online, I'm indifferent, but it's an application. And then there's the data that you're storing about those processes so you can remember, well, how much did David pay in taxes last year, or what is his driver's license? I know there's a lot more going on in a given government agency, but in a really abstract and simple sense, this is all that I really feel like I have to concern myself with. And then, of course, in a given country, or at a city level, there's all sorts of agencies or departments within that government. And when you think about the activities that they do, they all have to authenticate that user. Often you have to enter an address, you have to enter in some sort of identifier, a social security number, and then you got to fill out a form to do any service. And then that agency will then store or save that information for future use. And what you'll notice right away on this chart is in our current state, we often build these services kind of vertically integrated. And so every single time you go to a different agency or a different ministry or a different part of the city, you often have a different username. You have to re-enter your address. You have to provide some custom information that they want, and you've got to fill out a form. And we're rebuilding those systems over and over and over again. This is where we are in most governments. And the challenge everybody recognizes is that there's a lot of duplication and effort here. There's very, very few standards. And so your citizens are running into different experiences across the government. And that can be confusing and even threatening, where you're worried that entering the wrong information means that you'll be denied a service or denied access. The reality is actually worse. This problem is fractal. So if we were to zoom in on, say, just one of those services, say like the tax department, you would see they actually have multiple services that they run, and each one of those services is a vertically integrated solution that's usually stovepiped and separated from all of the other solutions. And then, they're saving that information about what's going on in that service in various different locations, sometimes secure and sometimes not. I hope that this very simple representation resonates with you, and many of you see the work that you do today as being working on systems that look like this. And the real question is what are we going to do next? How are we going to get out of this world of these kind of these like siloed, vertically integrated solutions? That's the kind of the North Star vision. And so the North Star vision is that we're going to move from a world that looks like what I just described to a world where there are some shared services, some common data registries that get used by different ministries, but are really kind of like tapping a canonical source. And this is really kind of what the Estonians have put together, which is that they've worked very hard to make sure there's only one source of truth for any given piece of information, and all the other players have to go and grab the information from that one source of truth. And then they've created a very nice interface layer to connect those various systems together and ensure that only authenticated and appropriate people are gaining access. So this is kind of like, this for me is what the future looks like. Another way of depicting that is a nice image that a former fellow who was with me here at Harvard did, this Richard Pope, who has a wonderful report about the governance of digital platforms that I encourage you to download and read. He modeled it like this, where you have, you can imagine this as a representation of government where you have citizen-facing services at the top, and then you have this kind of common set of infrastructure, so like some common platform services, so sign-on, payments, things like that. And then at the very bottom are the canonical data registries with information about your citizens or about assets that you're tracking and managing in your government. And that this kind of visual representation of the kind of architecture of government is where I think people are trying to go, and where the Estonians have managed to go more than I think anybody else. So if we accept this as a form of North Star where we're trying to get to, what I think is interesting is the range of strategies that we're seeing around the world about how people are trying to get to that destination. So one strategy that we've seen is what we call the kind of come in high strategy, which is we're going to go try to make the services that are facing citizens more user-friendly, better user experience, maybe standardize, like the design, there's a design standard, or, find design patterns, standardize those services so they're kind of easier for citizens to navigate. But to be clear, we're not touching any of the deeper, we're not creating shared services, we're not touching any of the databases. So we're going to come in high. And the theory of change here is that by doing the work here, we'll gain support of they'll see the benefits, and we'll gain support of politicians. We'll learn about these systems, and then we can leverage this to go deeper into the system and then start to build shared services and start to tackle the shared databases. So we come in high, we build public support, we build political support, and then we drive deeper into the organization. The opposite of that is more what the Estonians did, which is what we call come in low, which is the Estonians really focused on creating this set of canonical data registries and then connecting them together on the X road. And I think even my Estonian friends, I think, would concede that the user experience of their services has maybe lagged behind what others have done. They haven't always been as easy to use or as aesthetically appealing, but the underlying infrastructure has been vastly more sophisticated. So it's been easier for them to create new services. Now they're spending more time thinking about how to make them more beautiful. But they started at the bottom to use those to then start to create shared services and then start to rethink what the citizen-facing services would look like. So this is a come in low strategy. Another model for doing this is something we call land and expand. This is where a government chooses a single service, redoes that service on all the layers simultaneously. So Argentina, with its work of digitizing its driver's licenses, as I think is an interesting example of this, where they redid the database, they created some shared services, and they redid the front-end user-facing experience almost simultaneously. And then they're using that infrastructure to then go and figure out what is an adjacent service and pull it in, an adjacent service and pull it in. I think there's a case to be made that the Koreans may have taken this approach as well, where they initially designed services to make it easier for you to fill out some forms, and then they've just been adding more and more services and more capabilities over time. Another strategy that we're seeing is coming in the middle and just actually building shared components that all the different agencies can use. And so this is I think most prominently seen in India with the creation of Aadhaar, which is their biometric identity system, where now every Indian citizen can authenticate into a service using their fingerprints or a retinal scan. They didn't go and play with the underlying databases. They've just been connecting that authentication system with like the millions of databases that they have, and they didn't necessarily make the services that citizens actually use. So getting a passport, getting a driver's license, those did not necessarily get better, but they got easier to authenticate yourself into. They've built other of these centralized services too. So I think of payments, their UPI standard and the way they've driven that into the marketplace is another kind of shared component that they've pushed into the government and even in some ways into the private sector. And I think they're using those shared components now to begin to get governments to think about how they might construct canonical databases and then how they can improve the user experience on the service layer. Only two more to go. Another strategy we've seen is just an emergent API strategy. I think this is mostly seen in Canada and the United States. And this is, you have digital teams or consultants going in and fixing services, making them better. And every time they do, they just attach APIs to all the services and the databases they can find in the hopes that maybe in the future, these can be stitched together in some ways. And so you start to cultivate more and more APIs, and maybe you can start to use them to create more shared services and link different systems together. And then the final one is, I think a lot of people are kind of not doing anything and are just kind of waiting for Microsoft and Amazon and the big platform players to come along and solve all these problems for them and figure like it'll just be made better by them. So I share these strategies because I want everybody here to understand, I think there's convergence on what the North Star is that people are trying to get to, this model of canonical data registries, some shared common platform services, and then better user design on the service delivery side and building that out. And I think, again, the Estonians have a very compelling vision about what that looks like. But there are a number of different approaches that one can take there. And I want to share these because I would love to encourage debate in Iceland about how we're going to get there and what are the different parts of Estonian government going to do. Because you might actually have the local governments engaged in one strategy and the national government engaged in a different strategy that are not in conflict. They're just different, and they need to recognize why one's doing the other and find ways to help and support each other. A point I want to come back to in a little bit. So I hope that you see these strategies and can see ways to begin to debate them. Now, one reason I'm so excited to talk to you is I'm a huge fan of Iceland. I've very much enjoyed my time there and have had a great time, but also you are just very, very well positioned to do this in ways that I think other countries are not. You have some assets that other countries simply cannot have. And sometimes I'm worried that you don't even know what those assets are, and that you may even see some of the things that are assets for you as liabilities. But I actually think this is not the case. So when I think about the assets you have, some strike me as relatively obvious. I've been very struck in my conversations with my Icelandic friends and just kind of looking at the data. There's clearly, there's a higher degree, although your population may be small, there seems to be there's a high degree of internet penetration. There's a high degree, your consumers, your citizens are more sophisticated on average than many other countries would be. Internet literacy is high. And even this, like the skills of software development, design, are probably higher per capita in Iceland than you would find in many other countries. And so you have this natural talent advantage that I think is very, very interesting. And your public is already with you on this journey in a way that's not always true in other jurisdictions. This is a very significant advantage that should not be underestimated. I think this is probably assumed by many of you in the room, and you kind of go, yeah, that's just the water that we swim in, we're comfortable with it. But actually, it's a huge competitive advantage, and you shouldn't lose sight of that fact. The second is the size of Iceland. I kind of put this together because I was kind of thinking about Iceland and Estonia. And, you are geographically both relatively small and population-wise relatively small. I think some people would see that as a disadvantage, that the number of resources may be fewer in a smaller jurisdiction. I actually think this is a huge advantage that you have, in that it allows you to move more quickly, and that the coordination costs are so much lower. When I think about my colleagues that I work with in very large governments, these huge ministries, they have an enormously difficult time just talking within themselves, forget about across these ministries, and talking to different levels of government and coordinating is a massive effort that's required. Whereas you, I think, need to figure out ways to create loose, adaptive networks in your government. I'm sure they already exist in spades. And at your size is just an enormously compelling advantage here. And I just don't want you to lose sight of that. Another thing that I think is important about the size is actually having a weaker set of resources, having less money is, I think, an enormous advantage in this space. It's always worth remembering that when the Estonians started on this journey, their GDP per capita, I think, was something in the order of like $2,000 US. And even today, their GDP per capita, I think, is only kind of 26, maybe coming up to $30,000 US. It doesn't place them in the kind of top tier of like the wealthiest countries in the world. And this, I think, has actually been a source of advantage. When it comes to governments and technology, I have often found that having lots of money simply gives you the affordance to make bad decisions. You can afford to make bad decisions. But when you have very little money, you actually become constrained and think a lot about efficiency and scalability, and you actually make very difficult but good decisions. I also just threw in there your winning record against Estonia in football. So while they may be more advanced of you than today in digital government, you are more advanced than them in other ways, and you should never let them forget that fact. And you should chase and try to come and overtake them on the digital front. You're more than capable. If your football team can beat them, a country with a population that's 4 or 5 times larger than yours, to say nothing of the fact that you were able to beat England, I think you can come back here and you can beat them on the digital front as well. And I think they would enjoy and relish the competition. And that is actually my final big advantage is you're able to leverage the work that's been done by Estonia and by Finland. I'm so excited that Iceland has joined NIS. I'm really impressed by the work that NIS is doing and think this is a very, very compelling model. And so this is just an advantage that you're going to have that others are not. And so when I put all these advantages together, if this is, again, I want to be very sensitive. I'm not sure I know enough to say this is what your strategy should be. But if I kind of play around with plausible strategies, one world I can imagine is maybe you should be working across the government tiers because you're small enough that that's actually easy to do. And I would maybe have my local governments and the ministries just focused on the user needs and figuring out what are the design patterns and not working in isolation, each one figuring out what the design pattern should be and how their users want to engage with them, but actually working together to figure out what are all the common design patterns, and let's move towards a standardized approach so that when a citizen comes to an Icelandic web page, everything feels very familiar, even if they've never been to the page before. And that's true not just within a ministry, it's not even just true across the national government, but it's actually true across all levels of government. This would be, I think, a relatively unique accomplishment. I don't know anybody who's doing this across multiple layers of government in the world. And it would allow you to focus the resources of the local governments and the ministries on the place where I think they have the most expertise and the most capacity. Meanwhile, the digital service team in Iceland would be focusing on the other strategy, which is the coming in low. And their job would be to work closely with the ministries to figure out how are we going to build these canonical data sets that can serve both all of the national government, but I think critically also the local governments, so that they're not spending resources building up kind of citizen databases or who lives in their country, or who lives in their county, or who lives in their city, but they're actually able to leverage a national database that is kind of cheaper and easier to manage, and they're just leveraging that. And then, I think about payments and authentication and all of those shared services. I wouldn't have the cities going out and procuring those or building their own. They should be leveraging the national governments. And so this digital service team, Andrea, I don't know if this is exactly where you'd be focused, but I can imagine very much a strong focus on your team here and allowing the ministries maybe to build out more, like hiring consultants and working with user design experts to build out the kind of the top part. So this would be like a really interesting model for me to think about how I might approach this problem in Iceland, that I think you're really uniquely positioned to do. The third player that I've not included in this is the private sector, who I think could be helping advise on both of these fronts. And because of your smallness and your nimbleness, the private sector could then work with you and learn quickly. And you could then go out into a global marketplace and show how you've done this at a certain scale, and then help kind of medium-sized countries figure out ways to either adopt the X road or engage in similar types of digital transformation. And you'd be uniquely positioned because of your success domestically. Okay, I'm not going to talk about this, but I just want everybody to be aware. My friends in Reykjavik who have been with me have been doing this themselves, so I'd actually love for you to talk to them at some point if they would want to run a session. But one thing that we did do here at Harvard is we created a digital services maturity model, and we have a report where we describe it, and then we talk about what are the various capabilities that a government would want to have. I know Andrea has seen this, and I know the team in the city of Reykjavik has seen this. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but it might actually be interesting to have the Icelandic national team and the Reykjavik team talk about how they both filled out this maturity model and have a debate about what their competencies are and where their strengths are and what they're focused on trying to build more capability in, because I think that conversation could be useful. And then other cities might try to do something similar, and it could be a useful way to kind of talk about where the capabilities are that we have, and then figure out how should we be jointly investing. Because again, platform services are part of the capabilities here, and I'm not sure how much we should be asking the local governments in Iceland to be doing that. And so if the national government said, we're going to take that on, then they could then say, oh, let's not invest in that. Let's go invest in some other areas. So this is a nice chart that I think is a useful tool to help people just understand what capabilities they have and really encourage the teams to talk to one another and understand where they're at and kind of disabuse themselves of like misleading themselves to think that they have strengths that they don't. So I'm going to pause there because we're at 23 after and we only have till the half past. I'd love to kind of just open the floor up and hear if there are a few questions or concerns that people have. But I hope this kind of exploration of what other governments around the world are doing and the strategies they're taking just kind of open your mind to the possibilities, and that there's a really interesting kind of conversation about strategy here in Iceland that's actually across all levels of government that I think you are just very uniquely positioned to have.
Okay, thank you, David, so much for your great talk and your insight. We are experiencing a little bit of technical difficulties, but we heard you loud and clear, thank you. And we got quite a few good snaps of your freeze frame and your beautiful smile on the screen. I have a question for you. It's sent in by one of the viewers. Do you believe a small country like Iceland can become a global leader when it comes to digital and public service?
Yeah, so I think this comes back to one of the points I was making, which is your size would allow you, sorry, there's just a feedback echo, so I don't know if someone can mute the audio coming in from the, thank you. So I think your size does allow this. And where I would be focused is, where I was kind of talking earlier about this Icelandic strategy that I would be thinking about, which is that most governments really can only focus just on their own ministry, sometimes at one level, if they're really lucky, at one level of government, say at the national level of government. The fact that you're smaller means I think you can move faster. So you're gonna get ahead of a whole bunch of other governments and you're gonna learn more. So you're gonna have best practices to share. But then your size, I think, could allow you to coordinate across the national and the local government simultaneously. And almost no one is thinking about that right now. Nobody's doing that work. And if you were able to do that, then I think your government and the private sector that's supporting it would be really well positioned to then go out to the world and say, here's how we did it in a way that no one else has done yet.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. Do you have any questions from the auditorium? Oh, yes, Andri. Já, erum við með mikrofón?
David, thank you so much for the talk. What are some of the pitfalls that you've seen into governments around the world in this journey?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. What are the pitfalls you have seen other governments fall into in this area?
Yeah, I think the biggest pitfall is actually trying to do too much and not figuring out the high leverage places to go and start. So it does feel to me that the Indians and the Estonians have very, very different approaches to this problem, but the one place where they're united is in figuring out how you create a unique identifier that allows you to connect information and services from across all of the government to a given citizen. And that suggests that that's a very high leverage capability that you want to build. And so I think that the danger is there's so many places you can go. There's so many problems that one can tackle that actually focusing on the high leverage ones that if you solve those will then make subsequent problems easier to tackle. That's where you've got to get the political capital and the technical capacity and the public buy-in to go focus on those. And sometimes focusing on them doesn't yield like the shiny new object or the kind of the big pizzazzy flash that people are looking for, but you've really built core infrastructure. I think of this as, you're really building the plumbing. While you're doing it, everybody hates the people who are putting in the pipes and putting in the sewage system. But once they have a sewage system, they love it, and then they almost immediately forget about it. They forget it exists. It just becomes part of their life, and they're so grateful. But if you took it away, they'd be very, very, very unhappy. But this is the type of work that we need to be doing. It's really important. It's often hidden. It's not necessarily going to get you a lot of kudos, but it's absolutely essential. There's so many other things that are dependent on it. And once you have it, if you take it away, everybody realizes nothing works. Maybe just quickly, the trap, I think, is actually to get overly focused on trying to solve all the citizen services without building the kind of shared infrastructure that's going to make that job easier. And the trap there is that people will love you and the services will be better, but have you really increased the capability of the organization to do that at scale, faster, better, and cheaper?
Okay, thank you so much, David. There's another question. Are spatial information a part of the base data, and is it part of the shared idea of X-Road? Does that include OGC standard?
Yeah, when you look on the X-Road map, they have that I don't have the slide here, but they have their famous diagram of the X-Road. There is I don't know the specifics, so I want to be cautious, but there is a box that they have with kind of GIS in it. I don't know what the standard is that they use, but it's clear to me that spatial information is part of their kind of view of canonical data and kind of data registries that you want to have plugged in. And part of that is just, knowing the addresses, all the valid addresses in your country is an enormously useful piece of information to have. And you can't do ask once. You can't validate people where people live unless you have something along those lines. So I definitely think this is part of the future.
Okay, thank you so much, David. It was a great talk. Great to see you and listen to you, and thank you for your insight, and take care and stay safe.
Thank you so much. I hope you all have a good time.
Yeah, we're having a blast, man. Thank you. Woo!